The sauce?
Oh. Let me work my magic.
I don't know what this is. Holy shit, look at this fucking thing. Oh my god, what the fuck is that, bro? Jay, what the fuck is that? We're seeing some shit we ain't never seen before, kid. FBI, open up!
Wicked or weakness, you gotta see this. Yeah.
Pause. It doesn't look that bad. Oh, never mind. Proceed. Yes, of course this video is sponsored. It's sponsored by ℔°, aka the Japanese unloved manga translators group who translated this foul book, which enables me to make this video. So prove that you love them and their translations by being nice to them. And hey, look how much they upload! But getting on point, welcome back to the cesspool of humanity, and that little corner of anime and manga that isn't talked about in the mainstream and shouldn't be, and that's exactly why I'm talking about it, for educational reasons. Now, some people call me a fascist for not wanting to share links and gatekeeping the sauce, but it's from my belief, if you can't find the sauce from the title of the book alone, you most likely shouldn't be looking at it if you want to hold on to your humanity. It's not that I'm making the narratives of these books up, like the main character who slept with his stepmom just after trading her ovaries away for demon powers, which at the sum of its parts is another eerily disturbing Goblin Slayer knockoff about women getting raped and killed by monsters because the monsters like to rape and kill instinctively because they like it. At least in Goblin Slayer, the author attempted to justify the raping by saying it's the only way the goblins can reproduce, which is still nasty. But in this book, they do it for funsies, even going further than Goblin Slayer sometimes. Then you've got H-type manga like Hime, which is written by the author who wrote Killing Bites, and art by the artist who did Lord Marksman and Vanitas, who takes sake jokes from Metamorphosis way too far and creates the main character of this book named Hime, who should have been named Ice Queen after she's bitten by a bee and grows a stringer inside of her uterus. And no, I'm not making this up. I wish I could, but I can't. She gains the power of a zombie bee and stabs people and they turn into her slaves. The problem with the book is that it reads like an ultra-feminist manifesto and kinda endorses the death and subjugation of all men, but at the same time, in the same book that has Donald Trump go live on international TV and lambaste the Japanese government for allowing a 14-year-old girl and her terrorist friends to lead an insurrection and usurp the current status quo, only to reveal that a more power-hungry and sex-driven villain who likes forcing women into sex orgies with her powers is not only in complete control of the American government, but believes herself as a victim of a male-dominated society that oppresses women. But she herself oppresses women with her mind control powers and how evil and corrupt she is. And she likes it. I mean, look at this. This is what she does to people who aren't on board with her human subjugation slavery program. That ultimate aim is to spearhead world domination, transforming the world into her own personal authoritarian society where she can do whatever she wants. But again, because this book tries to address how hard it is to be a woman in modern society, it's the same book where every character is a Jason-born Treadstone level assassin, but has kids that bully girls into prostitution, leaving them with pennies in their wallet and creepy old men conveniently around the corner to molest them. Not to mention how good the art can be sometimes, especially when the hentai artist is displaying a character's most valuable assets, and you can tell the artist is really putting in the work on some of these pages. I mean, seriously? You know this one's eating garlic bread. But one of the most egregious examples of this is this page. I mean, look how ridiculous this looks. Admittedly, sexual molestation on trains, cars, and groping is a problem in Japan, but this is incredibly dumb. First, we've got the drooling ugly bastard trope, right? Second, he's gotta squeeze around this girl's armpit to get to her cereal box prize. Third, he has to lift up her skirt to pull it out. Fourth, he's gotta remove the protective wrapper. And finally, 5, he can get his dirty little mitts on it and violate her. And if you look way over here, this one man's getting excited by the prospect of what's happening. But what makes this page dumb is there's virtually no way nobody's not seeing this, especially when showcasing the space in the train before and after the pages. So the question becomes, why is this in the story? Can the character not control his libido? Well, it's because it feels the men are walking pile of vomits narrative and justifies this man's very public execution. Even when I showed this page to one of my female friends in Japan, she even thought it looked ridiculous, with most groping on trains in Japan being extremely low-key from her point of view. So if I'm interpreting what she's saying correctly, nobody's going to be reaching this far. To say this book is absolutely wild is a complete understatement to what it's really about. Again, it tries to be about how systemic misogyny has been normalized in everyday society and survivors of abuse like Zack Snyder's Sucker Punch, but it just doesn't work, especially when there are scenes where the main protagonist talks about massive social reforms and uprooting the problems of society while directing everyone like puppets to do so. Then you have backstories where the main character is sexually assaulted by her mom's boyfriend, and as repudiation for this, for whatever reason I can't explain, the mom takes advice from Saki's mom from Metamorphosis playbook and uses an iron and burns half her face off, scarring her for life. So ultimately, at the end of the day, Hime is a book that takes actual problems about society and has characters twist those problems to suit whatever their perverse agenda is. Let it be world domination, carrying out degenerate sexual fantasies, or doing something else idiotic. Whereas all the sound and logical arguments about how mind control is bad and forcing people to understand your worldview under the threat of a gun is completely neglected. Which makes the book all the more funnier when a character finally catches the main character lacking and is an advocate of free will, shoots up a school on the orders of the Japanese government full of brainwashed slaves that can spread the main character's perverse ideology of what she perceives as an ideal world through her uterus vampire stingers that also just happen to kill men and brainwash women. Of course, he's the bad guy for believing in a slower progression towards these social reforms that should have already existed if people used common sense, and not forcing these ideals that should have been normalized behind the barrel of a gun is somehow a bad thing to believe in, and murders him for it. In cold blood. That's until he gets a brain transplant and becomes our worst enemy and says he cracked open the crystal meth on this book and wait, what? Pause. Because I kinda sorta read the comments and I don't want to invalidate the suffering and trauma of women and men who have suffered sexual abuse and possibly worse, I like to say this book, the prior book, and everyone mentioned throughout this video are stories that are quite frankly so stupid I can hardly believe they're real, and or books that take logic and common sense to all its characters' graves for whatever reason the author decided, which invalidates and undermines their own message they've woven into the story. I mention this because some people are quite disturbed how flamboyantly I talk about these kinds of manga and crank jokes while laughing like a hyena most of the time, and quite frankly, most of these books in anime are either incredibly irritating to read or watch, or lacking artistic integrity when you look at the narrative as a whole, making everything that happened in the story just that stupid or knee-walking drunk when you're left wondering.
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
But returning back to whatever I was saying, because this is post-edit me, so yeah. Thankfully, I'm feeling nostalgic. So here's a history lesson from my point of view before we get into the morally degenerative content that will all but make more sense near the end of the video. Some people would say ever since the release of Orihimo and Arrow Manga Sensei, the degeneracy featured in anime has only peaked since the redo of a healer's debut. But rewinding back to 1998 will say otherwise. This was a time when hentai studios tried to make anime with bedrock stories and not be a spin-off of the porn they originally made, that only managed to choke on its own blood because the stories were written by monkeys on a typewriter. From animes like Mars of Destruction, which should have been renamed Mass Brain Cells of Destruction, and 1998's A Kite, aka Mezzoforte. Now, in 1998, when the original A Kite was released, despite its completely asinine and ball-dropping story, its well-choreographed action sequence make it almost worth watching and critiquing because it's funny as a Nicolas Cage movie that's so bad it's funny, but simultaneously manages to have an anal attentive cult following as if this hentai action thriller was Serial Experience Lane, Perfect Blue, or Wicked City. But it's not. It's an anime that glorifies sex and violence for the sake of beating your woody like a drum, and features characters more simpler and more transparent than they have any right to be without being thoughtful to the likes of shows like Gunslinger Girls and Modok Scramble, which dwell on the same themes of sex, violence, and political corruption, but with far more depth featuring characters struggling to cope and survive in the environment they live in, whether they like it or not, with the violence at least amounting to some artistic intention of tackling how hope is what makes the human condition worth livable. But A Kite and its spin-off and its sequel are absolutely horrid and spits narrative whiplash that'll make your head spin. For example, in one scene, a character can be an unstoppable bone-breaking assassin with Wile E. Coyote physics and the strength of a gorilla. Then in the next segment, the main hero gets her back blown out on all fours by her parents' murderer and is very aware of the fact, then tries to be in an unsettling psychological thriller / revenge fantasy about John Wick archetypes trying to be better people. And what doesn't help the story is the very fact that the people that they work for are sex traffickers, and the main character, Kite, despite being an uber assassin, is a sex slave. But at least rewind a bit, because you most likely rewind when I said the main heroine is in a sexual relationship, because that's what this is considering how many bodies she's dropped. She's in a sexual relationship with the man that murdered her parents and is responsible for turning her into a super assassin. Notice how that sentence doesn't make sense, and how it still doesn't make sense an hour after the OVA is over. So everyone must be dying for an explanation of why that's happening. Well, you see... And because, like Mars of Destruction, the story is moronic and operating on the power of one brain cell, therefore the reasoning of why this is happening isn't as important as to how it's happening. Meaning, don't think about it. And certainly don't think about how the main heroine is a super assassin and the emotional turmoil and the pressure that finally enables her to cowboy the fuck up and kill the man because it's not in the story. But what A Kite does feature is one of the most prime examples of an anime isekai protagonist dropping all of his or her points into luck and surviving all the bullshit, creating the craziest fall in anime history. It's even crazier than that one Tetsuo took in Akira. But it doesn't quite stop there. Somehow, some way, someone paid money for this. Kite has a live-action Hollywood blockbuster remake featuring Samuel L. Jackson, aka Nick Fury from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I guess he wasn't completely lying.
Does Samuel L. Jackson like anime?
Yes, I do.
This just isn't like you at all, old man.
Then let's get hot and heavy tonight, baby.
Hentai too.
But what's the point of this? Why am I telling you this? There has to be a bottom line to what I'm saying, and there is. But before we get there, we're going to have to chat up a spell about 2008's Kiss X Sis. Now, as the title implies, yes, this isn't a sophisticated anime, but a straight arrow story about moral degenerates that are not blood related, doing horny things to each other from dawn to dusk, solely because they want to. But where most ecchi and harem anime like To Love Ru and Heaven's Lost Property restrains its lewd content to eye candy and teases with cleavage, panty shots, nipple slips, and adult jokes sporting cohesive and digestible narratives that don't make you question if you're on the FBI's watch list or not, Kiss X Sis is a completely different shit tide, setting up the protagonist as a badly written Pornhub movie pogchamp that steamrolls through every female he meets, featuring disturbingly long makeout scenes, licking and sucking, just about everything, grinding, and masturbation scenes, and full-blown orgasms on screen, with the picky main character even managing to peg his homeroom teacher. Now, if all this sounds familiar, then you must be familiar with the anime and manga Scum's Wish and Domestic Girlfriend, which are incredibly bad anime, featuring eerily similar plots featuring eerily similar PCB crazed and sex-driven high schoolers that do what they do because they want to and can't control their libidos, and where the adults shouldn't be engaging in this lunacy, somehow they get wrapped up and tighter than peanut butter on jelly. What I'm essentially saying here is that if you watch anime and read manga as long as I have, books like Arrow Manga Sensei, Redo of a Healer, and Ori Imo didn't come completely out of nowhere, with hefty build-up to the ultimate Your Sister Ecchi series, which is Yogasa no Sora. Now, Yogasa no Sora, aka Sky Connect, is on my top 10 most hated anime list, because it's an anime that's so infamously vile. The only videos of it that exist on YouTube are videos of people who have watched the show and have massive regrets about watching the anime, trying to dissuade other people from watching it, creepy AMVs, and cursed clips and tidbits from the anime. And when you try to Google the series, there's question marks, like Google's asking you, why on earth would you want to watch this? But if you want skid marks on your psyche, you can watch this madness unravel for free on Crunchyroll, and you can help your parents lose their high expectations of you and try to explain why you watch this anime for the memes. But for whatever reason that can't be explained, this anime has a weird anal attentive cult following and manages to be worse than School Days because it's about twincest. And keeping in mind this anime is about incest, wincest, and 4 additional terrible relationships, I'm gonna play a clip from the anime, followed by a small portion of its ED.
What? What the fuck?
Absolutely vile. Misunderstood is a word and probably the nicest thing a person can possibly call this show, but I'm gonna call it exactly how it is. It's fucked. I mean, seriously. People were putting money into this, and the animators had the balls to put little kitty pictures of the incest twins growing up throughout the years up until the hair pulling ending. Now, it's understandable that sometimes people don't do the right or rational thing, but this anime has 9 episodes of failed relationships, so its endgame could look better than what came before, with people making arguments saying that this anime isn't that bad, saying Haru can't be blamed for what happened, which roughly translates into it couldn't have been helped, but the reality is that's just a throwaway line used by authors, not because this is the way it is, because that's just how this world is, but saying this world is how it is because the author wanted it that way. And there's no better example of this than in Sky and Connect, with Haru's sister's mysterious illness that constantly leaves her bedridden, in combination with her introverted and sheltered social life that revolved around her brother and their conveniently dead parents that aren't around to stop this, therefore allowing a close sibling relationship and codependency, factoring in again her mystery illness that makes her physically weak but strong enough to do the devil's tango with her brother when she's not hospitalized, meaning the author does everything in his or her power to make this relationship smooth like a paper boat in the sewer, allowing the main character Haruka to choose his sister over every loving and supporting woman that falls into his lap to keep playing his incest game. And like School Days, even though Haruka makes all these bipolar decisions, somehow he has all these moments with all these women, but he's always unable to resist the sexual advances of his blood-related sister. And the anime doesn't handle this subject matter any way that you can imagine is tasteful, but considering how morally wrong and leering this anime is, it wouldn't make any sense if its characters didn't have vapid backstories. For example, the main character, yes, the male main character, gets raped by his childhood friend who was about 10 years old with destroyer class breasts. So how did this happen? And why did it happen? There's not much explanation behind this event other than the fact that the main character's departure from his hometown cliche was so particularly painful for now, the rapist character, that she had to give him something he'd remember, and decided to molest the boy who was sitting around on his front porch minding his own business. Now, to color in some context, this is an anime that was an adaptation of a sick and twisted visual novel that's about 30 hours in length, but let's just say Nao had grown close to Haruka, so she decided to pop her cherry and rape him at the same time when things didn't go her way at home with mommy and daddy, because somehow this makes her feel good after her daddy dipped his hand into another woman's cookie jar. Now, assumably, this is the part where the anime explains that, right? No. And when she's done toying with him, and it's all over, and the deed is done, this character dips faster than Ito in School Days, looking more satisfied than ever, whereas Haru is looking more defeated than Jake Paul knocking out Nate Robinson. He can't get up, he can't even pick up his pants, and his ass cheeks are out there in the wind catching a breeze from when he was bent over backwards and screwed silly by a deranged 10-year-old girl. So if you thought it couldn't get any worse than child-on-child sex crimes, now is the time to put on your hard helmets, because it's time to wonder how this dynamically changed his character. Does he develop genophobia? A fear of women? Or does he tell his parents? Does he develop some kind of mental illness? Does he go see a therapist? Nope! Nothing changes. The story just keeps trucking on, indulging cheap fetish indulgences without considering the psychological fallout and impact of any of this, even after he becomes a sex addict. Fast forwarding years later, the rapist now is still clapping the main man's cheeks, but now he's on the DL and has had several frivolous sexual encounters with more than one person I'm certain he didn't even wear a rubber for. But this time, the sexual relationship with the rapist now is consensual, because that's apparently what rape victims do, or what the writer believes rape victims do. They form romantic and loving relationships with the people who abuse them. Yep, that completely makes sense, and this is where you'd think the story would explore topics of self-loathing, questioning or examining the human psyche and mind state of a teenage boy that believes he deserves his cruelty and what could possibly compel a man to rock for bed with his rapist of his free will and manipulate other vulnerable teenage girls to have sex with him when he really doesn't give a flying fuck about any of them. But nah, that's just Eugene for you. So instead, when they finally get busted doing the devil's tango, it's of course the main character's sister who walks in on them. You gotta remember, this is an incest story. And the funniest thing about this scene where he gets busting a nut into this psycho, not only does Haruka not stop piping the woman like a locomotive train when he got caught with his pants down while his sister's watching now scream her lungs out, the sister's most likely thinking about how she's getting NTR'd. And even when Haru locks eyes with his sister, the man's not lacking. He's got a flow going, moving like the tides of the ocean, most likely thinking he got enough time to bust his water balloon and jump out the window. But nope. This is followed up by the revelation that when Haruka was originally getting raped all those years ago, his sister was literally 15 inches away behind the door watching the whole thing happen, like Wolverine watching Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver do the Devil's Tango in the Ultimate Marvel Universe. But it's worse in that case because it was his kids. And the worst part about this entire scene is, with the sister revealing she knew about Nao raping Haru and sat on standby doing nothing about it, you must believe this somehow dynamically changes her character. But it doesn't. It makes everything make less sense than it already does. Because 2 episodes from now, she's gonna be sucking her blood-related brother's dick like a vacuum cleaner every morning at the breakfast table with his bowl of cereal and after school. I mean, listen to these smooth brains explaining why they think this is okay. Absolutely vapid. It's not okay in 2021. It wasn't okay in Oldboy, not the American remake, but the 2003 original, and even Game of Thrones, which takes place in an alternate 5th century, knows incest is wrong. For example, when Jaime Lannister tries to silence 10-year-old little boy Brandon because he's seen him give his sister his honey pop cereal. Meanwhile... And this anime has scenes of Eugene running home faster than the Roadrunner and Usain Bolt combined in his efforts to deep dig his own sister. But as the story continues in this one particular moment, when the main character and his sister get caught being heathens and getting their chimes on listening to Sweet Home Alabama, Haru knows it's over. He fucked up, and you can see it all over the man's face. And it's a big moment with big weight that can finally stir up some character development. But the camera decides to pan on the shot of him still inside of his sister, which is longer than it needs to be. Whereas in Game of Thrones, even Jaime pulled out in half a second and pushed little boy 10-year-old Brandon out that window. Dare I say, it's almost like Eugene likes getting caught. But for the remainder of the series following this, it's just Star Trek Picard facepalms and him trying to fuck the get away from what he's done, but can't because he knows he's terminated his connection with Jesus. And remember that other character? Yeah, with what she's seen, she looks about ready to have her own spin-off series where she has a mind break. But by the last minutes of the show, to escape the consequences of their actions, they torture every relationship they ever had and move to Germany where they can fuck all they want and continue their inbred, backwater, Romeo and Juliet story and turn their family tree into a recycling symbol. At least at the end of school days, Ito's bad choices catch up to him, considering how he blasted his Frosted Flakes in almost anything with panties on, and what he could plug into. Which makes you consider, what's worse? A man that watched his sister play with herself and pat like a dog that's grasping for a sip of water after running a marathon, or the man that had sex with 35 different women through high school, and somehow everyone's oblivious to how scummy that man is. He even has his own villains wiki page. That's how vile he is. But for clarification, let me answer that for you. Despite how these two anime relate to one another, by far the worst will always be School Days. Because whereas Haruka and Ito are absolutely atrocious people, being piles of vomit, appearing gentle and kind-hearted, but share a similar mission of maintaining multiple sexual relationships with women without facing any consequences for their actions. But only Ito from School Days has had sex with his birth mother, and got her preggers. Only Ito from School Days actually abuses and 4-letter R words a little girl that also happens to be his own daughter. Only Ito manages to maintain a 3-way relationship, revealing to one of the girls that he likes them for their bodies and willingness to do anything for him, and somehow get away with it. It's high heresy. The man's a dog-pig hybrid, and whatever he is, he needs to be put down. There's even one route in one of the spin-off visual novels where he scrambles the raviolis of all the female characters' moms. And the most disgusting aspect of the entire series is this character's views on women, viewing them as nothing but machines that need constant maintenance. Everyone's familiar with the School Days anime, but its source material is 20 times worse than the anime, and it doesn't stop being foul. It only gets worse the longer it goes on, and he's still somehow the main character, bruh. But of course, the novel franchise and its spin-offs, its mini spin-offs, has a convenient villain that Ito can blame for his personality disorder, which traces back to, of course, his father, who also is, of course, an incestuous serial rapist. But further examination of the overflow visual novel universe and its School Days and its multiple spin-offs reveals a more disturbing truth. It's a giant inbred clusterfuck extravaganza with no way of explaining any of it without this flowchart. Look at this madness. The main guy who started this, he's 38 years old, and look, he has 42 children. 42, with 16 of them with one of his daughters. Then you got this one other guy who impregnated 10 women, which 3 of them were his half-sisters, and with one of them was his own daughters. Seriously? And it just keeps going on. It's absolutely insane, and the illustrations makes it more eye-gouging. The entire Overflow visual novel franchise is high heresy and completely blasphemous, and it needs its entire bloodline expunged. I couldn't imagine the gauntlet of misery, trauma, and hereditary suffering these fictional characters have endured at the hands of their Zoo family experience. Pause. I'd like to point out that authors like Tetsuya Endo and Tayoshi Takaki are authors I hyped up for their artistry and creativity. And of course, Endo made it with his release of Spy X Family, whereas Tayoshi, he's still climbing up the ladder, trying to get that mainstream attention or notoriety. He wrote Black Torch, which was a series very similar to Bleach, but that got axed. He went in one shot called Freaks, but guess what? That didn't get published into a serialized series. Then you got other authors like Hirokoshi, who has written Boku no Hero Academia, which is massively successful. But if you were to look at his prior works, notice how a majority of them get axed, whereas you got something like the School Days visual novel universe, which is just about incest and a main character that likes having sex and this polluted bloodline, and the publishers and editors are absolutely ecstatic to publish this when they should be shaking their heads. But what's even more disturbing is that a lot of people apparently put money into this, and the overarching series has such a poor storyline, but more power to them. Now again, you must be wondering, what does any of this have to do with the philosophy of this particular H-type manga? It's not a complicated answer, but there's a pattern. Kiss X Sis, Kite, School Days, Himi, Family Sinky, and Sky Connect all have a through line in the sand that constantly gets erased. And the main problem with this manga series, as the prior series, and especially in Hime, Kite, the Overflow universe, and Sky Connect, is that these books have no idea how to hold itself to any accountability to the concept of consistency when it's dealing with real problems and what the state of the human condition is like, treating shock and edginess with frankness and with little respect or dignity of the tragedies that are befalling its characters, being so stupid I can hardly believe it's real. Not having a moral backbone that any other writer would have, which causes these stories to be perceived as an off-season April Fool's joke, while simultaneously dismantling the overarching message of whatever the story was trying to say, unless it was saying something hanky-panky and stupid. For example, Kite, School Days, Hime, and Sky Connect wants to say, abuse is bad, then backpedals on its themes with its lackadaisical characters and schizophrenic stories and characterizations that does backflips into dumpsters. So by the time it's all over, over, and when you're watching Redo of a Healer, or ReZero's over glorification of mental illness because you walked away thinking it's cool, that's a failure on the author of the story, and a primary reason why I hate ReZero as an anime. I continually point this out, but writers are like master manipulators, and their job is to induce synthetic emotions in the people to make them feel things about fictional events and characters. When that writer is good, you get books like Berserk and Goodnight Pun Pun. But ReZero's overuse and overglorification of the strife and suffering of its characters for the sake of creating layered characters people say exist but are really bare bone, and given foundation by their constant boo-hoo, look how miserable I am compared to you storytelling that spills blood all over its characters like a sheet of armor, whereas anime like Grimgar Fantasy and Ash, aka something I like, gets compared to something as narratively polarizing as Sword Art Online because they don't like the pacing or how it presents its characters. But everyone apparently loves Redo of a Healer, a story about an insanely evil man, and justifies their likeness of the series, saying though the story is about a terribly evil person, somehow people are overlooking how artificially constructed and contrived this story is, and how its bleakness and violence leans towards its main character's justifications because of course it does. But I know what people are already gonna say. You only like Grimgar Fantasy and Ash because
oh my gosh, look at her butt.
And it's true, but the difference is where ReZero bombards its reader and viewers with so much dumb shit and stupid decisions made by Subaru to somehow justify the series is a diamond without a flaw because he learned how to drown in his own blood and Ex Machina his problems away with its Ex Machina powers on the 100th loop using his time travel powers to do and say everything perfectly, it's somehow good. But why am I talking about ReZero, you must wonder? Because this book and ReZero have a common theme and message, but one story has a character waiting around with his dick in hand waiting for his ego to be stroked, whereas the hentai book conveys this message better than an anime that has numerous seasons, which is learning to love yourself. But before anyone can drown in all this H-type content and we watch this woman who looks like Saki drown in the psychopathic behavior, of course we gotta talk about Society, of course. And the last time I talked about Society, I predicted the entire Joker movie, starring Joaquin Phoenix, an entire year before it came out, according to some people in the comment section of my Shindo L Metamorphosis video. So hooray for me. I'm good about talking about Society, so without saying it, but saying it anyway because the world is an angry and sad place sometimes, as you might have guessed, those who have seized power in history, of course have no intention of relinquishing any of it, or potentially not using it in a corrupt way to serve some kind of agenda, while the voices of the people this said person sees power for aren't listened to or obeyed or given a consideration. Meanwhile, wealthy criminals and members of institutions continue living lives of luxury in their penthouses with their private chefs and gazillion-dollar cars, partying forever and ruling the world, while the remainder of the world looks up into the sky from poverty or their middle-class lives, struggling to put food on their table, fighting for chicken scraps, duking it out on the streets for the richest entertainment. Because you see, when the multi-gazillion dollar corporations and institutions that turn a profit off of people's misery say they care, they really don't. And they twist people's good intentions and pain into something they can monopolize and profit from, filling their piggy banks with more money they can't possibly spend, with their actions hurting innocents for the sake of more money, more power, and more control just for the hell of it, with most people's dreams and the stark realities of them being inflated and on the incline, whereas most superhero media, because the superhero genre has dominated the globe because of Disney, would preach otherwise and say that connection is power, and through connecting, caring, and empathizing with one another, instead of thinking about how people are walking wallets to them, people would and will have the power to change the world, because people themselves can change from connections made with others, if they are sincere and genuine with their intentions. But simultaneously, Disney as a corporation monopolized Christmas, a symbolic time of joy that's been corporatized by profit by many, with nostalgia infusions of timeless classic movies, and of course newer movies that are Christmas themed that are supposedly to die for. Taking a time for family, warmth, comfort, and a Charlie Brown Christmas to prey on the people who are trying to dissociate from reality and pretend that reality doesn't suck for 5 minutes and you're not trapped in a system that forces a debt onto you for you to succeed and be successful. And if I were to surmise why people resonate with Matt Reeves and Robert Pattinson's Batman, it's because Patterson is portraying a Frank Miller and Dwayne Cook hybrid of the Dark Knight that believes that change can only succeed if it's brutal, vengeful, and completely relentless. With this Batman even fighting the police because Gotham City is depicted as a capital of crime that's become a lost cause that isn't worth saving because it's the Wild West and an industrialized tool that's used by the rich to take advantage and control the poor, kicking everyday people living paycheck to paycheck to the curb, leaving them to rest in their own piss. Think of it this way: Batman is a hero of the people because his enemies are empowered and created by the systems of Gotham City itself, which appear to be circling the drain in poverty and a criminal justice system bolstered by a corrupt police force that would rather fill their piggy banks and uphold the law and order they're supposed to represent. With everything in Gotham City corrupt because of private individuals who represent private enterprises and private institutions making the city and the world work perfectly for them. For example, Arkham Asylum and Blackgate Prison are private facilities run by private companies that profit. In fact, most of the antagonists that enable Batman's Rogues Gallery are privately owned by some corporation or some shady company, and it's Gotham's corruption by these private companies that enable these facilities to run the way they do within Gotham City itself as the enemies of Batman. Don't believe me? In Batman Curse of White Knight, the antagonist of the book, Ruth Redford, turns a profit from essentially having superhero insurance policies that allow her and her power elite friends to pocket money from the destructive battles heroes have, buying real estate for cheap and selling it for the high, gentrifying neighborhoods, destroying families, while the villains Batman battle against unironically are funded by them, which is fucking diabolical, by the way. It's almost like the writers of the Batman comic series that has over thousands of issues is somehow using Gotham City and a man that dresses in a bat onesie to somehow write about our contemporary world. Isn't that crazy? Oh my god! Dare I say, it's almost like corporations and the mustache twirling evil businessmen and women that believe if it appeases the press and public every now and then and again, by changing their social media profiles from default image to pride colors for 1 month a year, nobody will take notice that most of them are legitimate power elite comic book supervillains that have really privatized world peace at the justification of defending a country that protects the business interests of evil men at the cost of being number one. Now, because this isn't a video about my political rhetoric, which I really have none because I don't care about politics, because when it comes down to what everybody wants and needs, nobody wants to believe in nihilism. However, because the present world is presently at odds with the world everyone really wants in reality, people create their own reality to escape a system and a world that doesn't change, in exchange for changing their own perspective of which we individually see as reality. Meaning, I have potentially misunderstood and misinterpreted decades of Batman comics to essentially make this video work by forcing it to work. Why? Because understanding our own reality isn't a choice we make. It's something we instinctively do, and the longer you suppress your emotions about the situation you're in, the worse you'll feel. And in any attempt to make yourself feel better, you'll dogpile all of your comforts on top of one another because it's the only way you know how to cope with reality and take care of yourself, even if what you take solace in is destructive and alienates you from the world at large and neuters your connection with people. In the case of Batman, Bruce Wayne believes he killed his own parents. Bruce Wayne believes if he wasn't afraid and scared of watching Zorro and had the courage to watch the remainder of the movie and instead of chickening out, his parents would have never died. He becomes what he fears. Bruce Wayne becomes the Batman and engages in a never-ending war against crime because he fabricated his perception of a horrible tragedy that wasn't his fault and decided to stop being a boy that was afraid of a monster in the dark, but become that monster to fight that fear of reality. Essentially, Batman is Bruce Wayne's worst enemy. In the real world, this could be translated into sex, it could be drugs, hell, it could be anime, to collecting Funko Pops and posting sexually explicit images of yourself online to feel validation from strangers. Again, this is something anyone would instinctively do depending on their situation. And it's not your fault, it's fear's fault. It's controlling, it's manipulative, and an invading emotion that paralyzes you with indecision and uncertainty. It's something we all feel because it's the world's fault. And nobody wants to be controlled and defined by emotional chaos, so what do? We fight it, of course. But imagine you do, and the whole world is at your grasp, at the tip of your fingers, and you drop it, and all your fears have come to pass, and the only way to conquer it is to kill it. But by trying to kill it, to best it in battle, you let it control you. Let's rewind a bit. Fear and anger are ubiquitous and easily felt emotions, and that tenacity of constantly showing us, the viewer, how fictional characters deal with their problems leaves a small imprint onto people. It's like the pizza scene from Breaking Bad, the ending battle of Sort of the Stranger, Cowboy Bebop, You'll Carry That Weight, and the end of Evangelion with Shinji choking Ahsoka. Did I just say Ahsoka? I meant Asuka. Asuka. But if we were to use another example from the end of Evangelion, you can use that hospital scene where Shinji develops post-nut clarity after winking his goose in a room that most likely had cameras in it, to be completely honest. But getting back on point, there's a stark difference between Western and Eastern culture, especially in the media, which has a way of affecting people's minds. In Grand Theft Auto 5, every point of view character's perspective is personal and selfish, but even worse than that, everything you do alienates not only your friendships with others, but you climb a tower of corpses as you kill, maim, and torment society and other people for the sake of getting a new car and attaining 7 digits in your piggy bank, as the title implies. That's why it's called Grand Theft Auto. And it doesn't stop there. These are the emotional backbones of what most America media is based around, which is about being a selfish asshole to some capacity. In Dishonored, your motivation is revenge. In Shadow of Mordor, your motivation is revenge. In Red Dead Redemption, your motivation is redemption. In Call of Duty, it's being a badass and forcing your ideals onto other people because that's what America does. In Breaking Bad, Walter White says he did what he did and became a drug kingpin out of love for his family, but of course, as it turns out, he did what he did because he could, for himself, and because he liked it. Because he couldn't forego his greed and ambition. And you know what? I liked it too. But what I like even better is that the fact that the Yakuza series, an anthology of video games that has the same narrative foundation and potential to be and house a similar level of violence as Grand Theft Auto, but deliberately chooses not to, being everything GTA isn't about, having a completely 180 philosophy that raises an eyebrow from my point of view. It's a franchise about collecting porn magazines, reuniting estranged families, and interesting subsections of culture and society, being an exploratory evaluation of people and how they live. And the main character, despite being who he is, manages to feel heroic and not have a body count in the thousands by the time the credits roll. So, yeah, Western and Eastern cultures are very divergent cultures, and where most things in American society are sensationalized, from being a high roller and being a raging asshole, having a bigger piggy bank than Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob, in the East, the culture is quite different, amounts to the fact that Eastern and Western societal and personality traits shape their reality and train of thought. Remember this because it'll be important later, but for the sake of hammering this nail in, America's individualist beliefs are completely counterintuitive to, say, Japan's collective way of thinking, meaning where Eastern cultures is interdependent, American culture is dependent. In simpler terms, most Japanese people would refer to themselves as a collective, using the word we to refer to a family or the word us to refer to someone else and their partner. It's about community and the strength of the family and or the society as a whole. Whereas in America, from birth to the grave, most people are taught if it's me versus us, I pick me. If it's us versus them, I'm still picking me. Fuck everybody else. It's all about me, me, me. And if for whatever reason I can't have my way, I'll press my button on my scorched earth plan and turn everything into crap. Ultimately, the main difference between both of our cultures is that where America puts emphasis on freedom and imagination and fisting anyone who gets in our way over receiving a cold cup of coffee, in Japan, everyone is expected to be everyone's sugar daddy and conform towards traditions and discipline, not coloring outside the lines of the coloring book or painting a dinosaur the wrong color. Most of the time, for most people, this is mandatory, even if you feel indifferent to societal expectations and your responsibility as an individual is to prioritize the collective over the individual, meaning yourself, regardless of your identity. Suffice to say, in basic terms, the East is everything the West is not, and vice versa, and the irony behind it all is that both sides shame one another for how they decide to live. And this translates into media and the stories we all read, where in Western or American stories have their audience be immersed in the fallacies of reality and what misery can potentially hold and how we can sometimes laugh at it. Eastern stories normally have high school students going off on an epic adventure where he or she saves the world and encounters a revolving door of friends and allies who will help them on their quest and become their surrogate family. But because this is an H-type book, of course none of that shonen jump garbly goo is going to happen here. But proceeding reader over healer, because I needed a palate cleanser and a factory reset on how Eugene was a complete moral degenerate, I did another H-type book before that about women getting their vacuum cleaned at Woodstock. It was completely wholesome, but guess what? Nobody watched it, so here we are again with this uber fucked up shit. So here's your obligatory reminder that if any of this nonsense ever happens to you or anybody you know, remember,
stop it. Get some help.
So the story begins where all stories like these begin. At the bane and pitfall of everyone's existence, and the downfall of Saki from Metamorphosis, high school. Now, though I've read this book on numerous occasions for educational reasons, of course, I come to the realization that the main protagonist's name is Yuuki Minami. It's right there on the first page. Well, what do you know? I just referred to her as Saki 2.0 and her sidekick as Subaru for not foreshadowing reasons that I will not elaborate on later. But when the story begins, Saki becomes vice president for her school's student council with the ulterior motive of using this position as a stepping stone to put on her resume to get into a prominent Japanese university with the end goal of becoming a successful and revered businesswoman, which I can tell you by the end of this story is not going to happen. And the only obstacle in her way is that she's kind of retarded, in a very literal term, and unfortunately, I don't know another word to describe what she has, but for certain I can say it's a myriad of mental problems that make the perfect cocktail that justifies this entire narrative. So again, at the start of the story, it's mentioned that Saki 2.0 is an introvert, and this is true, but it's not that she's pessimistic when she's more fatalistic, believing she's powerless to change the world, and no matter what she does, the outcome will always be the same because it's all predetermined, if not by her, then by societal norms, because her character doesn't understand that what will be is not necessarily what must be, and she lazily accepts the inevitability and potential end results, with most of her life being a horrific series of misunderstandings. But to highlight one of the worst aspects of her personality is that Saki 2.0 is a people pleaser. Not only when something happens does she jump right into action without a second thought, she pities people to stroke her own ego and make herself feel good because that's how she views her existence, setting herself up for failure to please everyone because that's what society expects of her. Trying to be everything to everyone, and in her attempt to help people, she manages to stretch herself so thin and in so many different directions she suffers for it, when it's not her job to have anyone like her, but her to like her. But because the collective is prioritized over the individual, she has to cowboy the fuck up, put on her fuck me pumps, and deal with it. But fast forwarding through her backstory of parental abandonment and lack of self-esteem, you'd be surprised if she didn't become a stripper. Everything I've been saying for the past 18 pages comes into fruition on these 2 pages, which enables me to continue with the story without taking a detour on the narrative and quickly gloss over what this means in a sentence as it pertains to Japanese societal standards. TLDR, Saki 2.0 has to fight for her happiness and be valued to others as she has been to herself. But as stated priorly, most of the nonsense in this book wouldn't have happened or to be tolerated by any individualist American woman, but who could say until the end of the video. To clearly state what I stated earlier, Saki 2.0 conforms to the stereotypical retro Japanese discipline and standard and receives affirmation and self-acknowledge it from purpose and duty, believing that people can't assign their own self-worth, and that self-worth is received from others with titles and labels assigned to them. Think of it like a chessboard. If a king tells a pawn you can be a bishop now, that's basically self-acknowledgement of the pawn's work being really good and he can level up. Now, we're going to transition to the woman who brutally beats this message into Saki and degrades her at every opportunity. Grandma. And it's not just physical abuse, it's mental and spiritual abuse, with the grandma again representing old Japanese traditions and customs, screaming about the obligations she's supposed to have because of her walking pile of vomit father. But skipping to the point 99% of people are most likely watching this video for, but we're going to gloss over because it's not very significant to the plot. We only talk about the plot here on this channel, where Sex and Metamorphosis by Shindo L represented Saki 1.0's chains of enslavement, considering the circumstances of how she was forced into prostitution. In this book, masturbation is kind of like a moment of empowerment for Saki 2.0, considering the burden of her existence carries and how she's forced to live her life. But that's only for chapter 1. Every time after that it's warped and twisted. But in chapter 1, it's something she chooses to do freely because it makes her happy and lets the boulder she's constantly carrying on her shoulders feel lighter. The only problem is, she's squeezing her gushes candy all the time and not doing it in moderation, so the endorphins released from the burst of her gusher isn't as good as it's supposed to be, which triggers the villain of the story to appear. Lucifer. Yes, that Lucifer. The devil. He appears, and waterboats her vajayjay for a bit, drops some foreshadowing, then carves numbers into her chest which indicate how horny she is, and controls her ability to manipulate time. As your mother survives, the maximum horny she can reach is 999, whereas the lowest is 0, and the only way to decrease the meter is to do the horny and sexual acts that she normally does, but by being more lewd, the number decreases more. It's as simple as that. There's no loopholes or fine print on the contract besides Saki 2.0 can relinquish her powers to Lucifer and live a normal life if she wants. But because everyone likes fucked up stories with the fucked up endings, of course that's not gonna happen. If you need an analogy or comparison, pretend Lucifer is like Ryuk from Death Note. Lucifer can only cross over to the human world if a human's desire for something is strong enough and they meet a certain horny criteria or specific criteria that's not really explained in the story. But then again, he could be hopscotching around the protagonist and lying, and it could be something completely different. But what's certain is that the story indicates that Lucifer has to be tied to a human to operate in the human world and grant them supernatural reality warping powers. And when that human dies, of course, he goes away until he can find a new host. So if you're wondering what Lucifer's motivation is here in the story, it's simply to kick his feet up and enjoy the chaos, because this is all entertainment to him. Chapter 2, from here on out, because the foundation of the story is set up and you understand how and why everything is happening, but it's nothing but hell for the remainder of the story, so we might as well go head first into all this horribleness that occurs and say something when something intriguing is said. Unlike the majority, despite my offense of the prior anime I discussed and most of my objections to the events that occur in this book and absolutely the next, when it comes down to the only reason why I critique these books from Metamorphosis to Account Girls is that despite being H-type series, the books are obviously about characters struggling with gross trauma and exploring sexuality, drug addiction, depression, and sometimes receiving fame or recognition for one's existence and circling these themes back to how that relates to the real world. And even when the sex scenes are eye-rolling or become nauseating, it's not sex for the sake of sex, it's saying something about society or about the character, and that makes it all the more intriguing, the fact that H-type books can actually have stories with underlying and very powerful messages sometimes when they're done well. No, Zoki Anna. But then again, books like Earth Girls manage to be none of those, because that's how the world is, and even though the story ends for our protagonist, there's still life in the story. Or these stories simply exist just so the author can live vicariously through their characters because they're horny and life's just not interesting and they're looking for some sort of entertainment. But let's just say this book and all the others are about the latter because it's more fulfilling that way, and we can believe Saki 2.0 doesn't get her face rolled by sweaty bastards and the devil himself for no particular reason. But it's about that time in the video where you can turn on Mahler, I have become lost to the world piano solo, because reality sucking and not being enough is a normalized societal thought that we all say, but really do nothing about it, ignoring it because it's the only real thing you can do, because nobody has any power to change anything, because reality is horrible. And most people wish they can be isekai to another world where fantasy and magic exist without getting hit by a truck. Kinda like the Chronicles of Narnia. And when you're not looking for pennies under the sofa trying to force the world to make sense and wonder why you aren't individually better than anybody else, and this feeling becomes even more suffocating with social media platforms and people raving and putting their achievements on display, albeit a high social media follower counts, likes and retweets, money and physically attractive body types, or whatever the latest thing everybody else is talking about, and you're not receiving a drop of clout or attention. That's all the things as a whole Saki 2.0 feels all the time. At a whole, websites like Twitter, Instagram, and OnlyFans are only demoralizing social media platforms that cause people to lose self-esteem in themselves and give up on their dreams, retreating into a false reality, an entree created for oneself through the gratification of other people to receive psychological gratification in ways against how your life really is. What am I saying here? Social media and social situations are theater. The only way you can really get to know someone is to catch them with their pants down at home, in their privacy, or seeing how that person behaves while being drunk and have their defenses lowered, because most people Photoshop attributes about themselves. Remember that other H-type manga I went over on this channel? The Fear of Emptiness? Account Joshi? It's the same thing. Saki 2.0 problem is, again, a combination of mental problems and cultural beliefs. In this one particular instance, she is struggling with math and feels that she needs extra time to solve these equations. Now, let me tell you something. As someone with a bachelor's degree in computer science, I'm getting a little sweaty looking at these equations myself. And when I was younger, I had problems with math, believing it was a series of emotional assaults that attacked me personally, striking all of my chords to irritate me, becoming too difficult to process at times. Until I realized in college math wasn't just numbers, but a series of instructions with beginnings, middles, and ends. And preceding that, I had an okay relationship with math. But in my heyday, much like Saki 2.0, I had problems. And sometimes, you need extra time. But again, because mental illness is stigmatized in Japanese culture, and considering the conforming social standards Saki 2.0 holds herself to, that's not gonna happen. I mean, she clearly needs help, but doesn't accept it because
we live in a society.
He said it! He said it!
And that wouldn't make herself look good. However, Saki 2.0 was able to complete and ace her test because of her time freezing abilities, which she'll use as a crutch to support her mental illness until of course it spirals out of control and she decides to become something subhuman and animalistic. Like she reached the peak of a roller coaster and getting ready to ride it down, which she does while riding public transportation. And let's just say some colorful things happen where even smells get her aroused and she thinks about her fantasies. And in the moment where she ignores her humanity and sense of right and wrong, she makes a beeline to Subaru's house. And this page tells you the remainder of the story, but for me to solidify the horror, I'll say it anyway, and she blows its back out. Chapter 3. Now, I know what you're thinking. You can't use that term. Saki 2.0 is a woman, but considering what just transpired, I'ma say it anyway because after lengthy exposition of her failed sexual attempts to seduce Subaru and getting rejected, which only reminds her of how she was abandoned by everyone that was supposed to care about her, and make a big deal about how her suffering is somehow more important than getting consent from poor Subaru. But even though she rapes him, believe it or not, this is a sorta kinda consensual sexual relationship for reasons that I'll explain later in this video that has nothing to do with the main character being related to that Subaru from ReZero, so don't think about it too hard. But for now, I'll draw attention to the fact that Subaru, an introverted teenage boy, for whatever reason doesn't want to have sex with Saki 2.0, a girl with no mental faculties over her libido, which isn't strange and something you shouldn't notice, but you can't blame him, especially when she takes one of her super thick high school textbooks that looks like a big cinder block and bashes him over the head with it. He goes down, but he doesn't look defeated as Haruka versus Nao, or Nate Robinson versus Jake Paul, so she's gotta strangle him. But Subaru fights her off, and after begging for his elephant trunk and repeatedly saying no, Subaru decides to give Saki 1/4 of the pie and finger blasts Saki 2.0 for the remainder of the chapter. And when it's all over, Saki dips faster than a monkey swinging on branches, then realizes that if Subaru hadn't caved in, she would have been a female rapist and lost her career and ambition. Then Lucifer shows up and reveals that the power she has is what she wants and what she needs the least, confirming that he's a fallen angel, Lucifer. Pretty much saying as much, then plays 3D chess moves on her inferiority complex and lack of self-esteem while goading her to return the power, which only makes her want it and need it more, making up whatever illogical justification she can grasp at to have it. Instead of resigning from the Student Government Association and extracurricular activities for the sake of her education, then say she never wanted to work hard, but always wanted to do things easy, which is counterintuitive to everything she does in the story. I point this out because someone like me would have used the time freezing ability to empty someone's bank at the ATM, or just flat out rob a bank, or freeze time and look at everyone else's answers. Saki 2.0 actually does what she says and uses her time freezing abilities to figure out the problem herself and not cheat. But of course, eventually she'll use this power for evil things because she's mentally unstable. Chapter 4. Like I said previously, the story continues to exacerbate Saki 2.0's mental illness and how she uses her power as a coping mechanism or a crutch so she can succeed for reasons already discussed earlier in the video. Thus, we can continue with the story and how Saki 2.0 pulls a Saki 1.0 move and uses her power to finally tell off her grandmother. You can tell she's using her power because her speech is completely changed and she sounds more verbose in her vocabulary, but this amounts to nothing. But Saki 2.0 then draws a line in the sand and says, blah blah blah, I'll never abuse this power, I only use it on myself and never murder people or anything crazy like that, which we all know is eventually going to happen. And those lines are about to become non-existent when she says it and does it again. On the same morning she says she want to use her powers to abuse other people, guess what? She does it. She tells off that bully girl that I will refer to as Tsundere-san because she secretly is in lesbians with Saki 2.0, and then declares nobody will make a fool of her again because she's getting ready to take a massive ego trip after, of course, Subaru rubs her Skittles candy and attempts to emotionally manipulate him into being her sex slave, of course, naturally. Chapter 5. Saki 2.0 finally gets the recognition she believes she deserves and constantly uses her power to hold even a minute conversation with everyday people. And as we talked about priorly, the nihilistic outlook she has and how she ultimately degrades and values people is a result of her trying to escape the reality of who she really is, using her power to defeat people she views as her rivals because she wants to be better than people, and she has become better than people. Finally allowing herself to be happy with how people recognize herself and others, she's finally able to give herself value. And that's not the only thing getting big. Apparently, Subaru's become Magic Mike with his fingers, and like how Saki 2.0 ego trip enables her to strut through the hallways of the hellscape known as high school, Saki 2.0 wants to expand her sexual horizons and wants her cheeks to get clapped, but it's around this time where she becomes a nymphomaniac and not a necrophiliac, which I said in my metamorphosis video by mistake. But anyway, by the end of the chapter, the author fucks with the reader, saying Saki 2.0 will wean herself off the power like all addicts say they'll do whenever they're doing drugs. But that can't happen, unfortunately. I mean, fortunately, because somehow the teacher realizes Saki has time manipulation superpowers. The fuck? Chapter 6. This is where the author stretches the credulity of the story by adding this stupid plotline, but at the same time makes sense when you think of the context of how this character has been depicted for the prior 5 chapters. You see, when Saki 2.0 gets busted, she gets called to the professor's office, where this smooth-brained idiot attempts to make a big boy brain play and blackmail Saki 2.0, the girl with time manipulation abilities. Now, according to Saki, when testing the boundaries of her power, she discovered if she ever was caught on film using her powers, it appears as a blur or a distortion on the camera in the footage. But the ugly bastard character has footage of Saki 2.0 and Subaru fooling around mixing around their trail mix snacks, and makes threats saying she'll never go to the university she wants or becomes the revered businesswoman, strong female entrepreneur character that she wants to be, because this footage exists. Only problem with this plan is, 1, what he just did and what he just filmed was child pornography, and threatening to upload it online, which is stupid, doesn't benefit him in any way, besides giving him a one-way ticket into prison. 2, this is the biggest mistake of this man's entire life. She has the power to freeze time and erase all the evidence off your phone, so there'd be no evidence to blackmail her with. She'd even have time to check his cloud accounts to make sure it's all gone before she let time flow again. 3rd, his overall theory is insane, and even if he did have concrete proof that she had this power, there's about 2 explanations called Photoshop and Adobe Premiere that could logically explain how someone could video edit that footage. Hell, I could do it from my crappy iPhone 5C right now! And I'm not even going to expand on everything that's entirely wrong about this entire scene. So out of these 3 options, either the ugly bastard either goes to jail for the rest of his life, or gets committed into a psychiatric hospital, then goes to prison. But of course, because Saki 2.0 didn't freeze time for about 10 seconds to properly think about this, or think it through, it's her fault. But it's also not her fault, considering preceding this, the ugly bastard starts off with some nipple play, then goes on a big Shakespearean soliloquy about how he always wanted to blast his Honey Nut Cheerios inside of a high schooler. Like, seriously, man? How did this guy even get a job in a high school? He needs to be in jail. This is wrong. But again, thankfully, Saki 2.0's head game is on point, and she knocks his ass out with a tape roller. Now, this is where the story gets kinda stupid, and the writer wanted to end the volume on a cliffhanger, so the entire scene I just talked about most likely had Saki at her limit, unable to use her powers, which I call bullshit on, of course. Chapter 7. Basically, everything I just said comes to pass, and after hospitalization, the ugly bastard continues to do evil misogynistic things and have evil misogynistic monologues about how he's an incel and how much evil he's going to commit once he gets out of the hospital. But then that's when Saki 2.0 pulls a move from the book of Toho, Saki edition, and he runs home and finds out that his entire house has been ransacked and all the evidence he had is gone, and to twist the knife in an already bloody wound, Saki sends a message and tells the man to punch his ticket and delete his existence. Then goes home, busts her cherry over the fact that she ruined a man's life and made him delete himself, which she's mighty proud of. At the same time, she's squeezing all the cake out of her Twinkie. Chapter 8 to chapter 13. The finale. For research purposes, of course, after a thorough look at Takashi Ohmi's production and publication list on his My Animes catalog, and definitely not another site that showed 121 different results with, well, let's just say I found a doujinshi named Remsan Maji Ecchi. Now, of course, I'm always here looking at the plot and the narrative of the story, and I've always hated ReZero, and I'm not gonna pretend that I don't, but I gotta say, if this video wasn't demonetized before, it's gonna be demonetized now, because in these 47 pages, Rem and Subaru, let me tell you something, Rem, I wasn't a Rem fan before, but man, when he got moves like that, I can see the appeal. Makes a man reconsider, with the point being, Takashi's son likes ReZero enough that he'd make this book and execute a well thought out plot twist rather than the source material this book was most likely based on. Which again, I dislike. I just like Rim, that's all. Though in this story, chapter 6 and 7 stagger the story with extraordinary favor, the end result leads the narrative into multiple interpretations while delivering a satisfying conclusion with finality. But to explain it better, I'll frame the narrative out of order from chapter 8 to the story's finale. So in chapter 13, it's revealed Țu̱rău is actually the main character of the story, and Saki 2.0 is the villain, and Țu̱rău has been using Return by Death to return to chapter 2 and restart the events of the story, and the most grueling part about it is that, of course, for him to reset the timeline, he has to kill himself or die to do so. And he's doing this because in the original timeline, before looping back to the 10th time, it's revealed that he accepted Saki's sexual advances from chapter 2 and they were actually in a relationship. But the codependency of the relationship overall allowed both characters to enable one another's addiction. For Saki 2.0, this was power, and for Țu̱rău, it was lust. And instead of becoming Edo Makoto from School Days, Țu̱rău came to the realization of the abnormalities around Saki 2.0 weren't normal and decided to break things off with her, ending their relationship. Accepting that sex wasn't something they did because they loved one another, but it was an obligation and something they did that became a toxic cornerstone of their relationship, and as long as it continued, things were only going to get worse and worse in terms of both characters fueling their addictions. But unfortunately for Saki though, at this point in the story, she has all the power, which is completely contradictory to how she was on her first loop. And on the 10th loop we're reviewing right now, she's insanely power hungry and won't stop for nothing without remorse. Whereas in the original loop, Saki committed suicide due to her depression and Țu̱rău leaving her, which caused Țu̱rău to encounter Lucifer to make a deal to save Emilia. I mean, Saki 2.0. However, that doesn't work either, and Saki and in every route, Saki 2.0 either gets killed, commits suicide, which happens 9 times thus far. So in the 10th time we've been watching, Țu̱rău decided to remove himself from the drama aspects of the situation and see if Saki could naturally overcome her hardships, even though this plan is completely tone deaf and enables Saki 2.0 to use Țu̱rău as a sex doll because that was his master plan. Of course, after 9 subsequent routes, until he comes to the conclusion that Saki 2.0 isn't responsible enough to control her own actions and is a cruel, capricious woman fueled by pure narcissism. Therefore, he wants to return to chapter 2 and convince Saki 2.0 to return the power back to Lucifer and getting her to believe in that someone's worth isn't a condition for someone to be happy, but being needed and loved by someone is. And at this point is revealed in another route, Saki was potentially in a romantic relationship with Tosundari's-san and had friends and everything came up Millhouse, until of course she dies. But the most haunting thing about all these routes is that Țu̱rău explains to Saki that she doesn't even make it out of high school, so she has to stop for things to get better. Now, I'm not gonna lie, he had me in the first half, but Saki 2.0 wasn't drinking the same Kool-Aid as me and tosses him. But rewinding back to the events of chapter 8, after Saki convinces the ugly bastard to delete himself, everything goes according to her calculations, of course, and Țu̱rău and Saki 2.0 have their normal patty cake session, and Saki 2.0 brings up again she wants her Rice Krispie treat eaten out, which triggers Țu̱rău's original timeline PTSD where Saki 2.0 most likely killed herself in front of him, which preceded by Saki killing her grandmother after something like this kind of happens.
Every day, he reminded me of what a failure I was going to be.
Miss, I want to be a doctor when I grow up.
Nigga, did I just catch you wanting to be?
But you know, Saki 2.0's mom isn't around to hold her and cry, but after Saki 2.0 kills grandma, she straight up becomes Light Yagami from Death Note and finally says due to how her grandmother treated her, she should have not even given her the light of day and called her trash, with the only problem being that she sounds like Emperor Palpatine most of the time during the remainder of the story, then drops mad shades on the woman and laughs like a hyena at her funeral. But to breeze through what remains of the narrative, Saki 2.0 libido has completely gone out of control, with her sucking her ring pop in public restrooms with most likely people listening in. She can't get her college recommendation because the principal opens up an expose article of her father sexually assaulting a woman and says, hell no, you're not getting a recommendation, your family is trash. And in an attempt to masturbate her sorrows away, she hears that Tsundere-san got a recommendation and is going to the same university as Saki 2.0 because she wants to be with her. And to Tsundere-san obviously doesn't say she loves her because she's a tsundere cliche. And the remainder of the story has Saki psychologically torturing her for no reason at all, though, for the fact that she can, and she's getting off on it, quite literally. And no, I'm not showing any of the pages of that. I mean, she's really getting off on that girl's misery. And now, her ultimate goal is to kill her while unwinding her fruit roll-ups on the roof of the school as she bleeds out on the sidewalk, which we know the ending to, which does happen. But fast forwarding to after Saki 2.0 kills Subaru and to Tsundere-chan, Lucifer, in a move that completely breaks the mold of Re:Zero, tells Subaru that Saki is a bad person, she's a villain, and he shouldn't save her, with Lucifer at the end telling Subaru that Emilia only cares about power and being at the top of the societal hierarchy of the world, and the story ends where it began, with Saki stumbling into Subaru's room and Subaru looking at Emilia with absolute horror, with the question, will Subaru stop simping for Emilia or not? I hope so. The end, but not the end. If you were to ask me under completely different circumstances would Saki 2.0 succeed in life with this power, the answer is a hard no. The woman has no self-control and is a complete psychopath even under apocalyptic standards. But as the book comes to an end, it's revealed that Lucifer found another villain to be the POV character of season 2 of this book series. No, this woman isn't a victim, she's a villain. And the only reason why I'm making a second video on this book series is because it's as interesting and as frustrating as the first 2 seasons of Dexter. Because let's not pretend the remaining seasons of Dexter, which are seasons 3 to 8, wasn't garbage. But if you're unfamiliar with the show, Dexter explores a character by the name of Dexter Morgan, a Miami forensic expert who spends his day solving crimes and at night committing them as a mass serial killer. Dexter, by the end of the show, has killed over 150 people, and guess what? He gets away with it. But what makes Dexter an interesting show is that Dexter lives by a strict code of honor that is both his saving grace and lifelong burden of only taking the lives of people who deserve it due to his compulsion and desire to kill, while trying to find true happiness living in a world that hates him for what he does, being Judge, Jury, and Executioner. You see, much like this series, Dexter explores a caged villain in a world he doesn't fit in but tries to adapt to, and if you were to ask Dexter why he kills people, he'd obviously deny that he likes it and would chalk it up to a checkers board of untreated mental and emotional illnesses that manifest themselves in homicidal tendencies, when in reality his character doesn't kill murderers because of some sense of justice. He only uses the crime of his victims to justify his murders because he was psychologically conditioned to by his father and he likes killing people. Because if it wasn't for his father, he'd kill anyone. But getting into the sequel of this book, to everyone's expectations, it's absolutely vile and completely tone deaf, being a train of crashing waves that ensues madness and moral degeneracy at a level hitherto undreamt of, making it not only difficult to process through, but manages to toy with and drag its reader along a story that lasts longer than it needed to, and crushes your soul up until its last moments when the police finally arrive, even starting and making me feel tired and yet all the happier when the police lock up this grooming teacher that has the power to transform into an adolescent girl, and you can imagine how the remainder of the story goes if you've seen this video. In fact,
911.
Officer! Right there! FBI! Come on in!
Now, I'm going to say this in the strongest possible terms in my vocabulary. I denounce, I repudiate, I condemn, and rebuke this book in the name of Jesus.